So let's start. So Andrew Vickers, who is a statistician at Memorial Sloan Kettering, has this famous discussion he has about you spend 5 years trying to perfect the skills of a surgeon, and yet you'll give any resident or any fellow SPSS, and automatically he becomes a stats expert. And in very much the same vein, what I will talk about, what Landon and Alan will talk about, you don't really get much in the way of education. So I hope that you'll derive some benefit from this. It'll be archived if you want to go back and look at it, but this is hugely important. Even if you're not going to be an academician, at least understanding how to review the literature and critique it properly, I think will make you a better clinician and researcher. So I think without further ado, Alan, are you ready to go?
Yeah, happy to do it,
Okay.
John. Thanks.
Let's just do that. So Alan will take control of the screen now.
Great. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for making the time on a late evening for many of you, I know. Are you seeing my slides now, writing a paper?
It looks very large to me.
Are you in a different are you in a portrait mode by chance?
Let me see. Let's try this one. How about that?
That's better.
Good.
That's
all right.
Better.
So thank you all for confirming that I've had problems before on Zoom. I'm a year and a half in, still sometimes Zoom challenged. So welcome all. Before I do more information about myself, I will disclose that I have no commercial COI since August 2017 when I returned from the dark side. So I'm Alan Schindel. I'm a professor of urology at UCSF. Also chair recently of the AUA guideline on disorders of ejaculation. And my particular role that gives me maybe some level of credibility to speak about this is that I was the inaugural editor-in-chief for sexual medicine, and I'm actually in that role at this point as well. I've benefited greatly over the time of my practice as resident fellow and then faculty member from the tutelage and expertise of, say, people like John Mulhall. And I did serve as an associate editor of the JSM for many years and learned a lot from that process. So certainly I've benefited from the advice and guidance of mentors, and I hope that those of you on the call here who are in fellowships are able to get that. And I believe that all three of us, I'll speak for all three of us, they were very vested and interested in this process. And we would love to find ways to support you in your academic pursuits and in your execution of well-written studies. So my goals here are to discuss the writing component of it. I will have some slides at the end where I'll go over some details of how to handle revisions when someone sends you the revisions that you will inevitably get from any quality review. There are some strategies you can employ to really make that as painless as possible. And I do hope that at the end of this, you will have some new strategies, maybe just a couple things you pick out that are interesting to you that you can employ next time you're authoring a manuscript. So there's no magic sauce, there's no magic recipe, but I do think that in most things, and writing is no exception, chance favors the prepared mind. And going into this, getting all of your kind of thoughts planned out before the research even starts, where do we think we want to publish this thing? There are a lot of journals out there. Obviously, we are partial to our ISSM journals, JSM, Sexual Medicine, and Sexual Medicine Reviews. There are certainly urology-specific journals, psychology journals, medicine journals, trauma journals. I found that having a wide range of options really helps me. Having a few in mind that you think you're going to target, but again, kind of thinking about where you want to send it before you even start is certainly a good way to get your stuff published. You do want to do your homework on the journals. You know, every journal has a landing page where they talk about, you know, some formatting stuff, talk about what they're interested in, maybe have some particulars or idiosyncrasies that are potentially going to be germane. And I'll say that ultimately, you know, attention to those details won't guarantee publication, but it will save a lot of aggravation on the part of the editors if you send things in showing that you've done your homework. It will certainly put your paper in a more favorable light. To let them look at that and say, oh yes, you formatted the abstract the way we like. You have the sections and the subheadings we like. That homework pays dividends and saves you probably from heartbreak of irritating the editor and potentially, you know, biasing them against your paper. I do think that fundamentally it is very hard to write a good paper out of bad research. So ultimately, when you conduct the research to begin with, having the protocol written ahead of time is going to pay dividends on the back end. And if you have a nice protocol and a process laid out for how you're going to do the research, you can in many cases almost just cut and paste. Obviously not a pure cut and paste, but you can basically import in the information you already have written down to inform your method section, which is fundamentally the most important section of your overall paper. I'm a big stickler And if you ever see a review come back that harps on a testable hypothesis, there's a decent chance it's coming from me. And this was something that was drilled into my head when I was in the Master's in Clinical Research training program at UC Davis, is that ultimately you always want to have a statement, preferably at the end of the introduction section, that really lays out in very clear terms, what are you trying to prove or refute for that matter? I think that this really adds a lot to the paper because it puts it in context. It makes it clear, what are you actually trying to do here? That it's not just a fishing expedition. It's not journalism where you're just kind of reporting out something you think is interesting. You are actually doing science. You are testing a hypothesis and gaining evidence to support or refute it, which is fundamentally all that science is. And I personally believe that this is applicable to all kinds of research, reviews, case reports, etc. I mean, I think you can think about a lot of these things as scientific inquiries in which a question is attempting to be answered. And that's really the framework that I like people to have in mind when they're putting these things together. I'm also a big fan of power calculations. I think a lot of the time people get excited when they get these massive databases of, the hospital records or Medicare databases, and they get 100,000 people and they have this massive study that is, it's going to produce p-values of like, less than 0.00001% for differences, even if the differences themselves are quite minor. So I think aside from doing the power calculation, you also want to make sure that your study is powered appropriately and that you adjust your threshold for statistical significance to perhaps be more reflective of the size of the study and also what is clinically relevant. Don't just look for a p less than 0.05. Try to find a p less than 0.05 for something that actually matters, a difference that's clinically relevant. And this is, again, just background stuff, but I think it informs the writing of the paper too. So another way to get in good with the editors, or perhaps not getting good with them, is that if you submit a sloppy paper with variations in format, variations in text, missing words, missing things, those are kind of basic errors that do still creep in to the submissions I see in my journal. Aside from the technical grammatical details, I think that there's a lot of benefit in having outside eyes. After you've been working on a project for a long time, you start to kind of gloss over the things that you've looked at a dozen times already. So it is very easy for things to creep in there that are perhaps hard to interpret, perhaps if you haven't been involved in it, don't make sense. You really want an independent set of eyes to maybe look at these things. And a lot of institutions have resources to help you do that. It's no shame in enlisting help. If you have stat support available, if you have a writing center, if you have English as a second language, there are a number of resources that exist to help you. And again, the goal is not to say that you need these things to produce good research. I think it makes the research more accessible, however, if you do everything you can to make the formatting and the proofing look really good as possible, to really kind of get people on your side. So every journal has its own kind of format. Most of them adhere to this. And I think that you can approach each section with these particular questions in mind. Why did you do this? What did you do? What did you find? What does it mean? I mean, if you're asking yourself those 4 fundamental questions, you can conjure up the text and the words you want to incorporate to build out these sections. And again, making them concise. I'll talk more about that later on in this presentation, but to the point and succinct is really a virtue in biomedical publishing. Psychology journals may be a bit more flexible. They like a bit more discursive discussion. And we blur those lines sometimes in sexual medicine. But in general, most of us are physicians. In general, most of us are surgeons. And because of that, most of us like to the point and concise. That's what we're looking for. I'm a big fan of introductions that take no more than 2 pages, preferably less, but 2 pages is sort of my limit where I start to get antsy reading it. And I think my interest here is not so much to kind of give an exhaustive detailing of everything that we know about something before we start talking about why we're doing research. The first thing you should do is kind of articulate, why does this matter? What do we not know about it? And therefore, because we don't know this thing about this important topic, I thought that I would do this research. And I'm going to help illuminate this thing that's not really clear right now. And that's kind of what you're trying to say. And it builds up again, as I mentioned earlier, to the testable hypothesis, the thing you're trying to really prove, and you're going to do this study to gain insight. Again, kind of what I had to say earlier, short and sweet is what I look for. And John can obviously give you his opinion if he feels differently, and Landon, and there's no necessarily right answer to this. But I think in terms of engaging the reader, making them get involved and get excited about it, you don't need a whole lot of pages. You just need to say, hey, this matters. Here's why. Here's what we don't know. This is what we're going to do. I really think that compels the reader to go further. So I'm a big fan of the method section. When you're a trainee or a student, it's this part that is most tedious and most dense. It's the part that it's easy to gloss over and just look for the bright, shiny headline. Honestly, this is how you get ignorance foisted upon you, though. I believe it was Benjamin Disraeli. I don't think he actually said it, but I think he was one that was quoted as a wise man does not use statistics to gain knowledge, but rather to avoid having ignorance foisted upon them. I'm not sure it was him or not, but basically it's a quote I really like. And I think you really need to read the method section, because you will oftentimes find that what's in the abstract or the bullet point headlines, and certainly what shows up on social media and lay public publications, is not always supported with what the methods do. So you really want to look at the methods. When you write the paper, you want to make sure they are very clear. And the thing you should be thinking about is if someone came along and read this paper, read the methods, would they be able to, within reason, replicate this study based on what I've said right here? So talking about details of analyses, talking about where data were found, talking about what software was used, you really need to put those details in there. And again, you can't incorporate every single tiny detail, but you do want to necessarily look at the things that are going to make it easy to replicate. I mentioned earlier, but size and power calculations, detailing who was approached, how were they approached, what were the inclusion and exclusion criteria. These are all things that are really essential if you really want to build a case for why your paper matters. Results should be succinct. This is actually, in my opinion, should be the shortest section of the paper, because ultimately it should be objective. It should be sort of linear. And I believe that in most cases, you are best served relying heavily on figures and tables for this section. I think the text should be reserved for things that are really important, the most salient things that you want to call out, and potentially explaining things that are, not necessarily entirely clear. I do see a number of papers that someone gets their SPSS results and they basically throw back at us this table that includes a bunch of kind of esoteric statistical terms. I'd recommend that when you get these tables back from your stats team, edit them, take out the things that aren't immediately apparent to the average, reader, again, the esoteric terms such as alphas and some of the other squiggly Greek letters that show up there when you get your reports out. Highlight the key things, leave out the other stuff, because big giant tables just usually wind up confusing people and they don't really add much to your paper. And it should all be objective. Ultimately what you're trying to say in this section is, here's what we found. Don't put spin on it. Don't try to explain it or say why it matters. The next section is where that goes. And that is the discussion. And here's where it's okay to maybe take some flights of fancy, to speculate and to maybe interpret. Again, you want to make sure that your interpretation is defensible. And you also entertain the notion that there are other ways that data could be interpreted. This is, to some extent, what could be done in the limitations section. It also just means being open to different interpretations of the data and just laying out, again, your case, why you think the results mean what they do, but being open to other interpretations and going on to also say, well, here's what else might be happening. And here's what other things you might be able to use to interpret these data. So this should be short. Once again, like the introduction, I'm a big fan of short to the point conclusion sections. Again, 3 sentences at most, in my opinion. 3 to 4 lines also appropriate. Sum it all up, say, here's what I think, leave it at that. So writing is a skill. It's a skill that people have in different quantities. And ultimately, scientific writing and lay people writing and creative writing are all very different things. Scientific writing is by its nature somewhat dry. And because of that, you don't necessarily have to have sparkling prose and perfect grammar and other things that are necessarily associated with really compelling lay people writing or novel writing. But I also think that you should make it clear. And there's certainly nothing wrong with authorial flourish, as long as it doesn't detract from the actual content of the paper. Some particular things that I find myself doing all the time, putting in a lot of commas, making very complex sentences, starting sentences with these words like however, nevertheless, on the other hand, but, ergo. Those are all terms that when I look at it the second time through, I realize I don't really need them. These are extra words that very seldom actually add anything. So I generally, on the second or third pass, will start stripping these out. Because even though I think that way and I write that way, I find these things oftentimes just don't add very much to the end product. So I try to take them out. So let's say you put in your paper and it was a nice piece of work, interesting stuff. You get your reviews back from someone like me or Landon or John. And I like this quote, like it not necessarily for the reasons you might think, but it was an article that I read about the role of the reviewer and what the reviewer does. And you can all read through it and kind of see where this author is coming from. The notion that the reviewer is this evil, awful person who's just there to kick down the barn. My take, and again, the way I would maybe rephrase this review, if I wanted to make it still say somewhat belligerent, I would actually say it's the opposite. I think it is actually much more challenging to do a good review. I mean, anyone can do a bad review, that is true. But doing a good review is a lot of work, and it's unremunerated work that really gets very little to no glory. So I have a lot of respect for reviewers, having been one myself, and even when I'm the author and I'm unhappy with the reviewers, I try to respect the work they do, and they can be a valuable part of your team. You also want to look at the editor. Ultimately, the editor is also someone who looks at the work, offers up their judgment, and you could certainly, if you chose to be like Anton Ego here, you could approach this as a place to exert power and control over people who are submitting up their work for your judgment. I really don't think that's the way it works. Honestly, in my opinion, is that the majority of us, certainly in the ISSM journals, are not here to make your job look harder or to reject your good work. Our job is to help you make it better. And that's really the way you should approach the reviewers and interpret what they have to say. And the good review could really help you. It can really point out the things that you potentially are not seeing. And having that external set of eyes really makes your paper better. Honestly, in many cases, I think the end product after the reviewers have weighed in is going to be a better product. It's going to make you look better too, long term. So the reviewers are usually doing you a service. Doesn't mean it doesn't always hurt sometimes when you get those feedback comments, but keep in mind and keep in the context of what it's for. So it is, when you get the revisions, important to consider, are they feasible? Can I do this? Is this going to need me to redo the whole project? And if so, is it possible? And it's okay in some cases to consider that if what you're doing is not really passing muster at the journal you're looking at, you could consider that maybe it's not worth publishing after all. I've had that. I've had papers that I've worked on a long time get rejected and kind of decided for myself that this isn't going anywhere. And it hurts and it's a lot of effort lost. But sometimes that's the way to go if you wind up concluding that your paper simply doesn't have legs that you maybe thought it did. I would also say that in that situation, even if you don't want to send it to that journal, you could try to salvage it, send it to a different journal. And that's where the homework you did ahead of time, looking at candidate journals, can really help you. So I would always put those out as options to think about, and recognize that even if you don't get published in your dream journal, having it published somewhere else will still get your name out there and still get the data out there that's important to you. So nothing wrong with trying again from a different journal. This paper, a guy named Annesley put out 10 steps. And again, these are steps that I really informed the process. So the first thing is naturally get angry. It's okay to get upset when someone doesn't see the genius of your paper and to kind of be unhappy about that. Try not to take it too personally. Certainly don't do anything the day you get them. Don't get online or go on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or any formal format, certainly, and complain about things. You can rage to your family and friends and kind of let up the demons, but ultimately take some time to cool off if you're unhappy with the comments. Approach it with a clearer head the next day. So, and then be ready to move on and redo what you have to do to get the thing published. It's also important to recognize on first read, it might sound like the world is ending and that the paper was just completely trashed and looked over. But ultimately, I think that in many cases, if they're bothering you to send a request for revisions, it means they like it. And there can be things, code words that are used in different letters indicating whether you can sort of count on this being something that will be published. If they say this is of great interest and some suggestions have been made versus substantial problems have been identified, which implies that, again, acceptance is never guaranteed in any circumstance. But reading the text of the letter and perhaps reading a bit between the lines might give you some sense of how close you are and how much work is going to be required to get this thing accepted at your target journal. It is good, once again, the editors will hopefully pick up on this and point it out to you, but to reread the kind of information, see what they're really looking for and make sure that everything is formatted the right way. But again, consult that again, consider what the editor's letter really says. And also think about what the reviewers are really saying. If someone writes you an epic review, to some extent, that's an honor. I mean, ultimately, if someone read your paper and gave it that much attention and spent that much of their time giving it to your paper, that's quite a service, honestly, because they certainly weren't paid for that work, or almost certainly weren't paid for that work. and they don't expect to get any real recognition beyond from the editor of the journal itself, perhaps. So it's really something that shows interest. Some different ways to triage this, and again, you can look at the comments right now and just kind of see, are these things that we can take care of with formatting? Do we just need to put in some extra words? Do we need to do more experiments? Or what, this isn't going to happen. We're not going to do this thing. And just saying that and being respectful about it in the reply letter and about why you wouldn't. So kind of in line with step one, get mad, get over it. Also wait and gather your thoughts. Take some time, think about, maybe a triage process. Think about how you'll defend the things you're not changing. And I would say that ultimately, sometimes this comes down to saying that's simply not possible. We can't do that with these data. We think that our things are still valuable, therefore do deserve to be published, even if we can't meet this particular reviewer's requests for further revisions or additions. So again, kind of reiterating what I'd said earlier, the reviewer is an external set of eyes that really can look at things and see perhaps where the tables and figures are perhaps limited and not as informative as you would like to. And it is important to, again, keep in mind that no matter how much sense it makes to you, if the figures and everything make sense to you, if it's not presented well, the reviewer is going to really struggle to understand what was really going to happen. And I think, again, that's part of where the figures that are clear and simple and to the point can really help you avoid a huge long list of text, especially text with p-values and odds ratios embedded with it. If it's a huge block of text with every possible thing laid out in numeric form, that's going to be a turnoff. That's almost certainly going to need to be revised after the reviewer takes a look. So ultimately, consider how you can be more clear, recognizing that the reviewers aren't perfect either, but ultimately it doesn't mean that you got it right either. And I like the sense of taking ownership here. This is something that's hard to embrace as people, but the notion not so much is well, reviewer, you got it wrong and you don't see my genius and you don't see how good this paper is. Think of it not like that, but rather, how did what I wrote, what did I convey that really didn't get the right idea across? And I think in many spheres of life, taking ownership like that's not easy. And it's not always right. I mean, some things aren't really your fault, but making them your responsibility in this context and probably many others will help you achieve things and fix problems as they arise. It's important, again, articulate where what you say makes sense and be able to support that with references or citations of other data that are out there. And it's also important to recognize that, sometimes the reviewer might be onto something. They might have something that's not really clear as in terms of criticism if they haven't really given you the specifics. And again, an example right here. If I, being an anti-introduction person, said it's too long, well, you could say, well, we agree, we disagree, and we think this is all essential. If I say that you included redundant and irrelevant information and give examples of that, it is a bit more on the author than to decide that, yeah, maybe this stuff is redundant and can be cut out. So again, if there are specific suggestions, do take them seriously. And if possible, and it doesn't change the meaning, probably best to just kind of go with those. Additional references, if they ask for them, consider putting them in as long as they are appropriate. Make sure that you understand what the reference is actually saying. And also being aware of what's already been published. This is, again, something that should have happened at the very beginning when you're doing your lit review and planning your project out. But ultimately looking in the journal you're submitting to, not that you're trying to fluff up their impact factor by citing their works, but recognize that if you're publishing something in a journal, good likelihood that something similar or germane to what you were publishing has also been published in that same journal. So make sure you know what's been there already. Important to choose your battles. Again, I would say in general, try to avoid picking fights over semantics or grammar or anything like that. Again, there's some things that aren't really worth fighting about. It's also not necessarily worth saying, well, reviewer 1 liked it, and therefore reviewer 2, you can, forget it because you're wrong, obviously, because reviewer 1 likes it. Recognize we all have different perspectives as reviewers. We all have different expertise, and sometimes we will involve a reviewer specifically because they know something. Examples that I can think of off the top of my head would be the technical details of a functional MRI of the brain, or more commonly, statistical analysis. There might be a reviewer whose only job, really the only reason they were asked, is to look at some complicated statistical model that was used. And if they don't have much to say about the other things, well, that's not really their job to do that. So don't necessarily take their absence of comment as validation of the other elements of the work. I alluded to this already, and again, it doesn't hurt you to start your reply, regardless of how you actually feel. It is okay to start your reply with, "Thank you for the insightful review and comments." You know, be polite in the letter, even if you don't necessarily feel like it. Put it in there. It doesn't hurt you to do it. It sets things off in the right tone when the editors and reviewers receive your comments and replies. I also generally like having the questions laid out and including responses underneath. So very clearly articulating where the modification is being made, what's being changed, etc., and include potentially the modified text into the letter itself. So you say, here's the change we made, and here's where you can find it in the revised paper. This slide deliberately brief, and you can see why. Ultimately, I, as much as anyone in the world, am prone to overly loquacious, putting too many words. 10 pounds of words into a 5-pound sack. So as long as the meaning is not lost, shorter is almost always better. My mentor, Jerry Andriel at WashU, once said to me, "No one ever says, 'I wish that guy had talked longer.'" And I try to keep that in mind in my writing and in my speaking too. Don't always succeed, but I try. It's also not wise, and this happens sometimes with our journal, the way it's structured, is that articles might go to JSM, it might be reviewed there, but rejected, but then sent over to my journal, Sexual Medicine. It is incredibly poor form to send them over to me with reviews there that are not addressed or looked at or replied to. And because we're one family of journals, we're aware of it when that happens, and that is not a good look for anybody. Even if you're going outside, let's say you have a journal, an article that was submitted to, say, Journal of Urology, rejected from there, so you come to us at JSM, it is very likely or even possible that the same reviewer will see the work. And that's happened to me more than once, that I've got the same paper at a different journal asked me to review it. And when I look at it and I see that nothing has changed, for me, it's almost like an immediate, no, I'm not even gonna review it again, because I've already done that and you have not put the effort in to make it better. And that's a big turnoff for me. So it's not gonna reflect well on you if you don't incorporate expert advice that you've been given from some peer reviewers. So again, my particular procedure here, your results may vary. I'm not saying this is the right way or the only way to do it, but this is the way I like to approach it. Kind of very simple, do the simple things first, get my colleagues, tackle the big ones later, and then highlight it as I go through to make sure that I've hit everything and I've covered all the things I want. So these are papers that I have used to help inform this. Again, the one at the top, it's about chemistry, but I do think it's a point-by-point reply thing that is very useful for authors when they do revisions. So with that, thank you all very much for your attention. I'll hand it off to the rest of the team now to keep going.
Well, and if you just wanted me to pick up directly.
Yeah, Landon, why don't you just carry on? Well, Alan has to leave, so maybe we should do this, Landon. Are there any questions that people would like to ask Alan before he has to step off? You can either put them in chat or you can unmute yourself and ask them. I think it was an excellent overview, Alan. I think it's something that you need to pay close attention to. I suspect that over the course of your fellowships, you'll just get a bit better at writing. Like reviewing, writing makes you a better writer. So, did I hear?
I didn't mean to leave so abruptly. I am going to be able to stay around, so I might just be on mute for a little while. I apologize for dropping off. As I said, I fail Zoom even now, a year and a half in.
Not a problem. So if you have questions for Alan, maybe you can just post them in the chat. Without further ado, Landon, why don't you proceed?
Sure. Well, then let's make sure this works. Can you see the presentation view here where it's full screen?
Yes, I can.
Good. Okay. All right. Well, so let's just jump into this. And again, congratulations to everybody. You're so close to being done with everything. And the nice thing about fellowship is it gives you kind of an idea. And even if you have a fellowship where you don't necessarily love the fellowship for things, it gives you an idea of who you want to be like, who you don't want to be like, what you're going to do, what you're not going to do. So there's a lot of things there. But over the next maybe 2 years, you're each going to decide what kind of person you're going to be and what kind of practice you're going to run and how academic you're going to be involved and so on. And so these are really relevant to your future on that. So, and I know it's late, so I'll try to cruise through these as best I can too. appreciate being with you. So by way of disclosure, so I'm an associate editor for the Journal of Sexual Medicine, by no means anywhere close to Alan or to Dr. Mulhall for things. So they're the kings of it. I'm just a little side associate editor here for it. As far as overview, so we're going to talk about why review, how we select reviewers, key factors for reviews, writing the final review, and what do I do if I completely disagree with the final decision that's made on things. So why should I review for the journal? I think this is a very valid question. Your time is valuable and it's going to take your time. You're not going to be paid for this, probably ever. It's unending. You'll get hundreds and hundreds of requests. If you say yes to one, you're going to get more in the future on it. And there'll be dozens of journals that'll be asking. I think there's two perspectives you can look at this. You've got the perspective of your white coat ceremony. When you first started medicine, you very much had an idea in mind of the type of doctor you wanted to be. And so there's this altruistic side of it, where scientific advancement has always been based on altruistic people donating their time and expertise to advancing knowledge, period. So you have to decide, are you going to be that type of person that's willing to donate a portion of your time to the advancement of and betterment of mankind? There's also kind of a side, maybe more negative way of looking at it. Are you going to be a policeman? In that there's no way I'm going to allow that to be published, or I want to have a say on what gets published or what's out there. And that's a way you can look at it as well. But I would say it's very important for good women and men to help assure that only truly beneficial therapies make it through. There will always be, different therapies that are going to try to be sneaky and get through publications and things. But really good reviewers and smart reviewers are so very essential for that. So it's a laudable thing to do. Well, how many reviews should you do? You're going to have to make that decision. Right now, you kind of do everything that your fellowship director gives you. But soon you're going to have to decide, what are you going to do? And me personally, once I became an associate editor, I thought, hey, I'm going to put time into this. I'm going to do a good job at this if I can, but I'm not going to, I turn down most other journals' reviews unless they personally ask, just because there's not enough time in the day to do everything for everyone. So it's a personal decision. I would say it's far better to do fewer better than more reviews poorly. So if you say, well, I'm going to start with one and do a good job, you'll always be able to jump into more journals later. So decide how much time you want to allocate, how many journals you're going to review for, and which topics you're best suited for. As an associate editor, we'll get reviews back all the time where we can just tell this person has no idea what they're talking about. And so we just kind of throw out the review altogether. It's better for you to indicate what you truly are good at. And then act. Don't feel badly turning down reviews for less impactful journals or ones that you don't really want to dedicate your time and life to. All right, what if you want a review, but you're not getting asked? And that's a real common thing early on. You feel like you've got all this new knowledge and ability, and you want to really get in there and get your hands dirty. Well, one, check your profile with the journal. You can see down here, I copied and pasted this from our interface that we use. It'll show what this person, all the different things that they say they're an expert on. And whenever we're searching for reviewers, a lot of times we'll automatically pull reviewers from those areas where they state they have an expertise. You can email the journal to get this updated or to notify them of your intent that you want to be picked more often. But most importantly, do a good job when you get the review. If you do a great job, you're going to be more likely to get more reviews than not. All right, how do we actually select reviewers? So I think this number is probably wrong. Dr. Mulhall can correct me later on this, but at the time when I originally wrote the slide deck, there were 17 AEs at JSM. And most often we pick people based on their topic, areas where they have expertise. But there's different ways we can sort. So R-score, and I'll show you what that is in a second, time since their last review and things like that. And ultimately, at least in my case, I usually pick 10 reviewers, knowing that I only really need 3 to give me results back, but people are busy at some times. And so you may not actually get selected from that list that's picked. Now on this score, you can see that current versus past reviews. So I can see this person did 22 reviews in the past year. They have none currently, and it's been 7 days since their most recent one. And their R-score, this is how we score them, and I'll show you how you get that in a second, is 2.89 out of a possible 3. So I know this is a very good, reliable reviewer. They're active, they're doing reviews, they're doing a good job with them. And so this one I know will be a reliable reviewer for the most part. Now, when we get the reviews back, typically we need 3 at JSM. And if it's a controversial topic, or if we get a lot of split reviews, maybe even more. And then as an associate editor, I'll go through and actually read the review for each person and see how I feel about their responses for things. And this is what an example of one that I pulled and just blocked some of the details. You can see that they gave a lot of comments to the author themselves, but this person didn't give any comments to the associate editor. And it's really helpful if you give these. This is a good spot to put things that you really feel, or should this be accepted or not. In this case, they did an okay job as far as going through some of the details here. Now, when we get it, we'll rate the reviewer. So, and almost every journal does the same thing as well. It's timeliness and quality. So if you want to be reviewer of the year for JSM, review of the year for Journal Urology, other things, turn it in quickly and do a good, thorough job, and most likely you'll be in the running for it. And you can see in this case, we just have a 1, 2, or 3 type thing. If they're severely delayed, and to me, that's like, we give 2 weeks for these. If you are 2 weeks in a day or 2 weeks in 2 days, you may be here. If you're like 7 weeks late, well, we'd have gotten rid of you a long time ago after that. But let's say you're 20 days, then you'll be marked down here. And then basically how good was the review overall. This is also how AEs are selected. And I assume even editors-in-chief and things like that will, if you're a good reviewer, you're a good associate editor, you're a good editorial board member, and you'll be a good editor-in-chief for things. Now, we actually make the decision. Oftentimes, we'll definitely review what the reviewer sent to us, but we may disagree with their final review. And I've had a couple where they say, accept, accept, accept. And then I say, no, this really should be rejected, or reject, reject, reject. And I say, no, this really should be accepted. And so we won't always 100% agree, but almost always we will, particularly if it's a good review and they know what they're talking about and they have good background on it. So sometimes there's a bigger picture that needs to be seen. And again, it depends on how quality the reviewer is or how experienced they are with it as well. All right, so how to give an optimal review. Really, an optimal reviewer is one who's more, someone who's going to be able to judge fairly on things. It doesn't necessarily have to be something you agree with, but think of yourself like a referee. Bad reviews are ones who focus real heavily on grammar only, or spelling, or typos, and they get this real extensive list of all the different typo things they can do. Or they'll be very brief. They'll give you 2 sentences in total, and they won't give you any AE comments. Something that's real delayed, you can have an expert reviewer who does a great job, but they're so late that they're not helpful to the process. If you're not knowledgeable, so don't even sign up as a specialist in an area unless you really feel like you can be knowledgeable in that area. As Alan had mentioned, being too confrontational or patronizing. And this is real easy early on. I found that early on as a fellow, I was like this. It's like you're in a battle and you're going to go in there and you're just going to like give it to them, of all how horrible this is, whatever. But that's not good. All caps is yelling, and always has been, always will be. So you want to be kind in the words that you use. And again, realize you've been on both sides of this coin. So definitely treat it that way. The other thing, a bad reviewer accepts or rejects based on their bias. So before they even read the paper or look into it, they already know that they're going to reject it. And that type of reviewer or AE or editor-in-chief or anything is not ideal. Again, you want to be a referee and look for good data versus bad data. Always be willing to change your opinion on something. To me, this is the way to do it, as far as both writing a paper as well as reviewing. Good reviewers are good writers often. Good writers are often good reviewers as well. So what's your study objective? What are the authors trying to go about doing? And everything should be branched off of that. The intro should help set it up. The method should be appropriate for being able to address that. The results should present the key things that are focused on your objective. The discussion should highlight why this is relevant in context of the other literature. And your conclusion should only be based on those objectives. So when you look at any paper, reviewer or writing it, what is your underlying goal at the outset? And this is relevant because, at least I used to do this. I'd spend a ton of time on the intro and discussion, and honestly, they aren't that important. And I always, worried about my word choice, like Alan had mentioned, all these little things. As an AE now, I almost never look at those things, or very minimal. Just I want to see a couple key things, but I don't care what words you use or how you set it up for things. I mean, these are real, just stylistic more than anything else. Mostly I'll look and see, did you miss any key papers? Are you really putting this in the context of what the literature is? But these really aren't that important. But what's the objective? Everything is going to center on this. Is it an important question? Is your whole study hypothesis something that's relevant? Is it testable? Is it explicitly stated? We know exactly what you're doing. And has anyone else already asked this question, and have they done a better job with it? You can have a great paper, but if someone has done a better series already on it, it's just not going to be accepted. Because why? There's nothing new that you're necessarily offering. Methods. So, and Dr. Mohal and Dr. Schindel are both very, very good about this. The methods need to be appropriate for it. So the study design has to be able to answer the hypothesis of the study. So causative studies, if someone's going to say this causes that, they have to be set up as an interventional type design. It has to be prospective, it has to be randomized type trial. And these need to be registered with clinicaltrials.gov or whatever the equivalent would be, wherever it's being sent from around the world. If they're not, actually in 2021, I would say it should be rejected outright. There is no journal that should accept a randomized controlled trial if it's not registered in clinicaltrials.gov at this point. And the reason is it keeps people from cheating, from moving the goalpost to a different area compared to what they had at the outset. You don't want to change the objectives mid-study. Also, the specific questionnaires need to be able to address the study question. It's real common with testosterone literature, for example, that someone will put up an ADAM questionnaire and then use that to prove their point. Well, ADAM questionnaires can't. It's been shown and we've known for a long time. So just make sure that the questionnaires that they use are able to address the underlying issue with it. Your primary objective should be explicitly stated, and the study needs to be powered appropriately to address that. And the different measures that are chosen as best as possible need to be objective type measures, and the design needs to be appropriate. Now, secondary outcomes, in contrast, don't necessarily need to be powered for it. These are kind of like side, hey, we wanted to look at this as well, but we didn't know if we were going to have, we didn't power the study for it necessarily. And that's why they're a secondary objective. So the design may not be appropriate for these. Questionnaires may not be optimal, and that's fine. These are just secondary objectives, but the primary objective needs to be designed appropriately. Now, what about statistical power? So as Alan had mentioned as well, statistical significance does not necessarily mean that the intervention was proven successful. And I'll show some examples of this in a minute. This is highly, highly prevalent in andrology studies. You will see many, and usually they're from similar authors, but they'll have 10 patients, they'll see statistical significance, and they'll say, aha, this showed that this intervention proved successful. But if you have 10 patients in a study, it's a pilot study, and that's it. Even if it's a randomized controlled trial with a placebo, 10 patients is a pilot study, and it is not designed to determine if the therapy is effective or not. Here's an example of what I mean. So let's say you have testosterone and you have placebo in a randomized controlled trial. And let's say you see that 8 out of the 10 had a benefit and 2 had an adverse effect here. And placebo, you had 7 and 3. So in this example, you say, all right, the p-value is 0.15, that testosterone therapy does not cause cardiovascular disease. So in the testosterone group, you had 2 who got cardiovascular disease. In the placebo group, you had 3. This is what's called a type 2 error. It's very, very common. And it's akin to saying, all right, I tested 10 men with smoking. I made them smoke for a year, and I saw that basically none of them got lung cancer. Hence, smoking doesn't cause lung cancer. And basically, because it's not powered adequately and it's not designed adequately, you can never make any negative conclusions this way. You can say that it failed to show a statistical difference, but you can't say that that it does not cause something like cardiovascular disease, for example. So a more accurate conclusion was the study was not sufficiently powered to assess this variable period. And when you look at the New England Journal, there was the T-trial study, had about 800 people in it. And they were very appropriate in how they stated the conclusion. They said the number of participants was too few to draw conclusions about the risks of testosterone therapy, period. That's all you can say. You can't make any further statements on that. And again, this is the most common clinically relevant statistical error, I think, that you see with literature. Conclusions. So the conclusions can only state the data that were presented in the current study. Conclusions is not the time to go off and hypothesize about how this is relevant to X or Y. They need to only highlight things that were presented in the study itself. Now, you can make very definitive statements if your data supports it, and if your objective was set out and the methods were set out that way. So they don't have to be soft always. They can definitely be definitive. And secondary outcomes typically can't have as definitive statements because you didn't design the study a priority with that secondary objective in mind. All right, 2 contrasting examples. These were both very controversial papers, and I would say they have very different outcomes. So example number 1, and these are in the published literature. So this was a treatment intervention for Peyronie's disease. It was a randomized placebo-controlled trial. There were 22 men in the study with 11 in each group. Wasn't registered in clinicaltrials.gov. It wasn't registered with the FDA as an NDA, and they didn't disclose their conflicts of interest. The primary objective was not stated in the abstract. The details on measurements weren't provided. There were no standardized questionnaires. There was no power analysis. Interestingly, the results showed a statistically significant improvement in placebo, which at the outright says your methods are not well designed. In other words, you maybe have needed to be better blinded, or your measurements being obtained needed to be a little bit different. So and the statistical comparison was likely flawed. They didn't compare the change in means between the two groups, which is how you have to do a randomized controlled trial. They based it against baseline, which you can't do. And they didn't even provide enough data to know if their statistics were done correctly or not. You should be able to replicate statistics based on the data provided. Interestingly, their conclusion was, blank therapy is safe and possibly effective for Peyronie's disease. All right, example number 2. So again, this paper would just be outright rejected because there are many, many errors there and issues there. Now, this was another one. This was one that was accepted by JSM. It was the one that I was the AE over at the time, and it was a new treatment for cosmetic correction of flaccid penis. I personally was very against this therapy. Strongly was against it. But again, you're a referee. That's your job as a reviewer. This had 400 men. It was a retrospective study. The outcomes and measures were very clearly defined. The limitations were clearly highlighted. They showed that it was non-validated, retrospective, single surgeon. They disclosed their conflicts of interest, and their conclusion only stated findings from the study with no editorialization at all. And this one was accepted. And again, I was very much, and still am, against this therapy very strongly. I mean, it's being litigated all over the place now. But from a study standpoint, they did everything right, and they followed the rules, and these were the data that they'd accumulated for it. So again, you may not agree with either therapy. First one was claiming level 1 data, which is crazy. The second one was only claiming retrospective type data, but the credibility of the second one was much, much better because of the things that we previously talked about. All right, finally, how to write the review. So these are just some real quick examples. So here you can see they just copied the text from both. That's not really helpful. This one's also too brief. It's focused on grammar, font, things like that. So this would be one that we'd rate as a 1 as far as an overall quality. This one, you can see that it's nice to have these AE comments. And again, you can be brief in those. Just tell us if you were in our shoes, would you accept it or not, and why? And then the review itself here was just too brief and generally pretty poor overall. This one had a pretty good example of comments to the author. So they went through, title and ideally you'd go through, step by step the whole paper. But again, nothing to the AE, which would help us to know, should we accept this or not, regardless of what you told the author for things. Now, what if you disagree with the final decision? Well, you can certainly write a letter to the editor. You can also indicate that you would be willing and would like to provide a commentary on the manuscript. When we turn these in, we just check this box that says, yep, this should receive a commentary, and here's who we think should do it. Now, in summary, good reviews are just absolutely essential to publishing good science. If you're going to spend time on a review, spend it on what is the hypothesis? Is it designed appropriately? Are the results that are presented sufficient to address the hypothesis or their objective? Can other people test it? And are the conclusions based on purely on the data presented and appropriate based on the design and hypothesis itself? And with that, I thank you for your time and turn the time over to Dr. Mulhall.
Years after I've met Landon, he still calls me Dr. Mulhall. So let me just get this slide on here. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and do this, and we'll finish up with the sins of scientific publishing. So this is really about publication ethics, which is important. We spend years and years generating a reputation, and it takes one episode of academic malfeasance to lose it. And there are scores of examples of this, and several within andrology. I have no commercial conflicts of interest. So the 4 R's of publishing, just to introduce those of you who haven't heard me speak on this before, the material needs to be relevant to the journal in which you're publishing. Okay, we get lots of papers submitted to us on BPH, for example, or on infertility, which we don't consider. Rigorous, I think between Alan and Landon, you get a sense for what rigor really means. Reproducible. So the goal in writing your methods, for example, is to help other researchers do the exact same study. You have to put as much detail in there as possible so it can be reproducible. I think you're aware, probably over the course of the last several years, there's increasing concern that many of the seminal studies published, at least in the psychology literature, have never been reproduced. They're just not reproducible, which raises questions about the validity of the data. And very importantly, and I'd strongly encourage you to think about this as you write your papers, they need to be readable. Increasingly in the scientific literature, urology literature, andrology literature, you have a page of statistics that renders the paper almost unreadable. The classic example that is the Vigan paper published in JAMA on testosterone and major cardiac events, major adverse cardiac events, and just the utilization of obtuse statistic analyses, and it just makes things very difficult to understand. The most important career asset to you is your reputation. Please never ever forget that. So the sins in publishing are as listed here. We'll go through them. Plagiarism, fabrication, falsification, misciting of references, misreferencing, authorship malpractice, reviewer malpractice, undeclared conflict of interest, and failure to acquire IRB or Animal Care Committee approval. The potential consequences of this are not minor. Some of these sins are considered academic fraud. At the very least, if there's a concern that there's any malfeasance going on, the manuscript will most probably get rejected. You do get black flagged. We do have a process where when people are submitting papers, for example, that are plagiarized, and especially if they're being plagiarized on more than one occasion, they get a kind of a black flag by their name. Now, not all plagiarism is necessarily stealing information from other people's papers. It may be self-plagiarism, where you're just recycling material that you used before in another paper, which is not looked upon very, very favorably. You can be banned from publishing a specific journal. In the last couple of years, we've banned 3 people for persistent plagiarism. In one of those occasions, letters were sent to the chairperson of the department and or the dean of the medical school if a medical school was involved. So it can cause all kinds of internal institutional investigations if you're not careful. Notification can also be sent to scientific organizations in which you are an officer or a committee member, alerting them to the behavior, and we've had to do that on one occasion in the last few years. So fabrication, it's pretty obvious. It's a fake study and data, partial or complete. There are famous names in the field, I won't mention them, from certain countries in the world, where it's clear to experienced researchers that large single author randomized placebo-controlled trials done in a very short period of time in a country where we would say it's really difficult to do that level of research raise red flags. And what that has led to retractions of people's papers. These are often single center, single research studies. They have incredible structure and data. I work at Memorial Sloan Kettering. We have 14 research study assistants in urology. I have a statistician who works with me. I have a database manager who works with me. We have regular auditing of our databases, and still it's very difficult to get perfect data. In fact, if you look at our research, the dropout rate's not insignificant. And when I see these papers coming out of certain centers, private practices in Europe on testosterone, where there is perfect follow-up for 5 years with no dropout, that is almost impossible to see. Journals may ask you for the actual data, and as a reviewer, if you're concerned about the data, I think it's perfectly reasonable for you to suggest in your comment to the editor, to the associate editor, that this is a case where perhaps the data should be reviewed. And we've done that, and we do that, and we do write letters to the authors asking for data. If the study is trying to change clinical practice through an intervention, whether it be surgical, medical, or psychological, for example, we're very cautious about publishing that without reviewing the data. So just don't do it. Falsification, this is adjustment of portions of methods or results section. This is most commonly seen in photoshopping of immunoblotts or photomicrographs. If you're not in the basic science field, you may not be aware of this, but this is a fairly common thing that goes on. There's now software available to try and pick this up. But this is, again, if found out, is very serious. Okay, there was a situation recently where we had our basic science editor review a paper, and I don't know how he did this, but essentially he realized that the immunoblot presented was actually identical to an immunoblot in another paper on another project. So, you know, a letter went to the author about this, and the paper was rejected. Miscitations, misrepresenting the structure or findings from another study. This is most frequently based on quoting a miscitation within another paper, often in a review article. So for example, if you're writing a review paper, I would strongly encourage you to go to the source data and not just look at another review paper that says Smith et al. 1985 found this. Go and look at Smith et al. From 1985, because it's actually fairly common that review papers miscite the data, the conclusions, the findings from a paper. So go to source data, very, very important. Misrepresenting, constructing a reference list that does not accurately represent the current literature. I reviewed a paper several years ago from a famous journal. They allowed 25 references, and 20 of the 25 references were from that journal. And it just didn't represent the current field, the literature in the field or the area of sexual medicine that was being explored. So please, when you're reviewing, please look at the references, and don't be afraid to comment on them. Using a lot of review articles, book chapters, or abstracts. Technically, book chapters and abstracts we would not like to see used as a reference, with rare exceptions. Review articles, likewise, we'd much prefer you to use the source data within a review article than the review paper itself. Using a lot of older articles, it's hard to justify having a reference on a paper that's from 1974 with rare exceptions. So make sure that you're writing papers that have contemporary reference lists. Using a lot of your own work is a concern. Self-citation is a concern. It might just be that you are the world authority in area X, and the top 3 papers in that area are your papers, and that's okay. And an experienced reviewer, an experienced editor will understand that. But it's perfectly reasonable for you as a reviewer, for example, say, there's appears to be a lot of citations from Dr. X in this paper. We'll look at that very carefully, but it is a means of augmenting your own H-index, and that's something that needs to be kind of decried and is looked upon fairly unfavorably. By the way, when you review a paper and you're saying the reference list is missing key references, it's frowned upon if you suggest papers of your own. Now, there are circumstances where that's appropriate, but you want to be very cautious about suggesting to an author that they cite new literature that is yours. Okay. Using a lot of references from a journal in which you're endeavoring to publish. So, you know, you might think it's a good idea to cajole the editors into thinking, oh, they cited 10 of our papers, but the papers have to be relevant to the topic at hand. And, you know, the journalists do get screened by what's now called Clarivate to make sure that they're not doing heavy self-citations. And there was a journal, not in sexual medicine, but in science over the course of the last couple of years that didn't get a impact factor for a year because they were accused and proven to have a very high rate of self-citing. So don't be lazy, be vigilant when you're doing the references, whether you're an author or whether you're a reviewer. Landon, I think this is from our project that we did. Incorrect reference utilization, duplicate references are provided in the bibliography in different locations. That happens from time to time. I think if you use a reference manager, you should be able to avoid that. That's often a very innocuous error. Unrelated references, the text and cited reference are not related. This is not uncommon. Reference 34, it follows a statement, and you look in reference 34 and you see no mention of the statement that's in the paper. So don't be lazy, be careful when you're referencing your paper. Unverifiable statement, the textual statement is vague and cannot be supported by the given statement. Also includes meeting abstracts without subsequent publication. You know, we've published looking at data presented at the AWA sexual medicine sessions, and it's only about 50% of them are published within 3 years after the AWA meeting. It's about 67% in American studies and less in international studies. But not everything you see or read that comes out of the AUA is actually published. Published anywhere. Not all of it ever gets published. Wrong reference, the incorrect reference is listed in the bibliography. That's more often than not an innocuous error. Errors of interpretation, discrepant conclusions. The textual statement and reference conclusions are inconsistent. The textual statement and reference demonstrate clearly discrepant findings, or the textual statement goes beyond the results reported in the reference. So again, when you're citing literature, don't be lazy, be vigilant, and make sure that you look at it very carefully. Suboptimal reference utilization, inappropriate reference, an alternate reference demonstrating a given technique or categorization is provided in lieu of the original description. A review article is referenced to provide individual study findings in lieu of the original study, to highlight a particular statement or analysis from the review discussion, or to provide support for lists of ideas such as mechanism, treatment options, disease. Don't be very cautious about what you're citing, is really the message from the slide. This is the data. This is a project that Landon and I done that we haven't yet published, but these are looking at 468 total citations, and there's a 31% overall error rate. Errors of interpretation, you can see, discrepant conclusions, discrepant data, overstatement. Suboptimal references, an inappropriate reference, uncommon. Review article, finding statement, and summary, the most common. And website errors, uncommon. An incorrect reference, a duplicate, unrelated reference, unverifiable statement, and wrong reference. So there's a smattering of errors you can make in the reference section. Just be cautious. This is an increasing concern among journal editors, the concept of authorship malpractice and authorship manipulation. And authorship manipulation really refers to the idea that you have, let's say in JSM, we've got a maximum of 8 authors. We routinely get papers coming in that have 12, 14, 16 authors. And it sometimes is incomprehensible to us as editors how you have a case series of 60 patients and 16 authors on there. So a corresponding author gets a letter asking them to justify, and sometimes that communication doesn't go well. They withdraw the paper, et cetera, et cetera. But this is not an innocent issue. And it's not an innocent issue because there are famous names in urology who have the world's greatest collection of third authorship positions on papers. And people just add each other's names to papers. And there are some countries that are more renowned for this than others. And the problem is that as you have your paper number goes up, your H index goes up. And if you're being considered for an editorial board position, an editor position, a position within an international scientific organization, when we look at people's CVs, we're looking at the number of papers and the H index. So it's not a victimless crime when this happens, and it's something that journal editors are increasingly on the lookout for. Just as concerning, and we've had this happen several times in the last few years now, is failure to credit co-authors, okay? Including papers where the data is based on a PhD thesis, for example, and the PhD candidate's name is not on the paper. The mentor has basically stolen the idea and the data and not credited the PhD candidate. We've had one of those situations happen in the last couple of years. Authorship disputes are very, very difficult to manage from a journal editor standpoint. It's he said versus she said, et cetera, and it become very, very nasty, and sometimes goes all the way up to the dean at the medical school or the chairman of a department, et cetera, to get it resolved. My suggestion to you in your effort to put papers together is have a clear discussion very early on in the project as to who the authors will be and what the order will be. And ultimately, that's probably going to come down to who the senior investigator is on the project. But that's a conversation I think you should have upfront very, very early to avoid some very nasty experiences. We have a suggested maximum number of 8 authors. All authors are supposed to make a significant contribution. That is physical or intellectual commitment, okay? You don't have to come up with the study design to be included in the paper, but you have to have some input, whether it be writing and editing or whether it be data analysis, so some intellectual contribution. Putting your friends' names or chairperson's name on the manuscript without significant effort is inappropriate. Listen, that was very common when I was starting. It was very common to see chairman's names on it. That's kind of basically fallen by the wayside. So putting your chairperson's name on the paper, unless they've made a significant contribution, it is not appropriate. And so let's kind of get away from that. Not a victimless crime, select authors with care. And as I said before, try kind of figure that out. Really, as the project is coming to a conclusion and the paper looks like it's going to be written soon. This is a very detailed, this comes from COPE, which is the Committee on Publication Ethics. They're an excellent website. And so you can see things that raise concerns about authorship issues. Language quality in the manuscript does not match that of the cover letter. The manuscript was drafted or revised by someone not on the author list. Tracking in the manuscript shows that the authors have been added or removed. It is almost impossible when you get a paper accepted to add another author onto the paper. We've had several of those, including from major, high-profile, prolific research in the last year, wanting another author placed on the paper. You can't do it. It is almost impossible to do that. I like this thing, the impossibly prolific author. Certainly that's a major concern if the person's first author or senior author. It's not uncommon for somebody to have a smattering of second, third, or fourth authorship papers. But the impossibly prolific author raises concerns about authorship validity. Authorship changes without notification during revision stages, that's a red flag. If we see that, if the first author changes between the initial submission and the revised submission, that raises a red flag, and that's a communication from us to the author, the senior author, corresponding author, as to what's going on. Several similar articles have been published under different author names or aliases. We do screen the papers. We do have a plagiarism screen, which also gives us a sense for authorship and prior papers in that area. A similarity check shows work derived from a thesis where the original author is not on the author list. We had an incident of that in the last year. Questionable roles of contributors, so the 16-author paper for a 60-patient case series. Unfeasibly long or short author list. We always raises alarm when we have a single author on a randomized placebo-controlled trial. And that was the person I alluded to earlier on, who had 10 retractions in the last 10 years. Unspecified roles in an acknowledgements. Name an author list known to be from an unrelated research area in the field of sexual medicine, somebody who happens to be in physical chemistry or something, raises alarm bells. Authorship problems, urging self-citation, that's a concern. Again, as you're a reviewer and you're urging the author to cite your work in the paper, that's really frowned upon. Having competing interests. So this is interesting in our field, for example, because we have people who are heavily aligned with one of the two implant manufacturers. And as they review a paper that is clearly Coloplast or clearly Boston Scientific, and they are a consultant, a real consultant, heavily paid consultant to the other company, should they be allowed review? We have these issues that come up from time to time. Misappropriation of authors' research. Fortunately, I've never come across this in our field in my many years of being involved, but it's well reported in other fields where the paper gets rejected and then all of a sudden one of the reviewers goes and does a similar project and gets it published, and that causes some nasty interchanges. Manuscript decision colored by being an editorial board member of other journals. So for example, if you're on the have a leadership role, an associate editor or a deputy editor-in-chief or an editor-in-chief of JSM, you can't have a leadership position in another journal to try basically make sure the optics are that you're not going to reject papers and use your position to this extent. Inappropriate language within review. If your justice is not exactly on authorship, but if you're going to write a review, be constructive and be kind. Everyone's trying their best to try get papers published, and just be nice. You can be critical, but just be nice. Subordinate reviewing is very relevant to all of you because this is, there are many people in the field who just give any review that comes into them as a professor of urology, for example. Just give it to the fellow and don't actually look at what the fellow writes. That's not appropriate. It is perfectly appropriate for your mentor to say, I'd like you to review this paper, and then we will go over this review once you've done your review, and we'll write the review to the journal together. That's how you would learn, of course, and that's appropriate. But having you just do it is not appropriate. I can't see what the title says on this one, actually, to be honest with you. Undeclared conflict of interest. Okay, so the implications are obvious, right? So you have to have your conflict of interest declared. This COI rarely results in rejection of a paper. If you declare it's okay, we'll look at it. and we'll make a determination. I can't think of a single case in the last 10 years where we didn't review a paper or accept a paper solely because of some conflict of interest. But we want to see it, okay? Full disclosure of relationships, industry, nonprofit organizations, that's disclosure. The editorial, the team then defines if conflict of interest truly exists or not. Disclosure of memberships and other editorial boards will be requested and really required. We're going to finish up with plagiarism, which is the most common problem in the field. Use of words or phrases or greater from other papers. We've had many, many instances in the last year where people have cut and pasted paragraphs from other people's works verbatim into their papers. And that's an absolute no-no. It is impossible for you to tell us that that is an innocuous error. It's certainly feasible that innocently you use a statement from another paper, but not complete paragraphs. We use Authenticate, which is the screening software. So it gives us a clear sense for what phrases or sentences or paragraphs came from other papers. If you're citing somebody else, there has to be attribution. So if you're using a phrase from another paper, it's probably best if you say something to the effect that Smith et al. Said blah 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 blah, and it's got to be cited. You've got to credit the author, the original authors, for what you're stating. Self-plagiarism or text recycling, we've talked about this before. It's usually purely innocent, but it's not allowed. Okay, and the sticky reason why it's not allowed primarily is that technically, when you publish a paper, the copyright is owned by the journal. Okay, it might be owned by the medical society as well, but it's owned by the journal, the publisher. And so you really can't be using the same paragraph or the same table exactly. Now, we get questions all the time about, I want to publish a table. You can publish a table, editor-in-chief decision, if from another paper, if you say amended from, you've used the original table and you're editing it a little bit to make it slightly bit different, but giving them attribution. That's perfectly reasonable. And if you've ever any questions in these regards, this is an excellent role for the editors. You just email the editor, JSM editor-in-chief@gmail.com, and you can say, I'm in the process of writing a paper. I wonder, I had one of them today actually from somebody that all know, I'm sure very well, a young rising star in our field, who asked about questions about the use of photographs from another paper. And so please feel free to reach out to us. Duplicate publication. So this is a well-known problem, and it's most commonly seen where a paper is published, let's say in Spanish, and then an almost identical paper is published in English. So it's very hard to track that, to be honest with you, because the plagiarism software doesn't really cover other languages. So we are on the lookout for that, but it can get kind of difficult to track that. Besides the ethics of plagiarism, it infringes upon copyright, which is a legal issue. So you have to be very careful there. And we've had terrible squabbles between authors and publishers about copyright over the last several years. And invariably, these things turn nasty. So just avoid it. Now, we've had situations happen where there was absolute clear plagiarism. I'll give you an example where there were 2 paragraphs in a paper that were cut and pasted from separate papers, 2 different papers. They were cut and pasted from 2 separate papers into the paper that was submitted to us with no attribution that it came from another paper whatsoever. So the intimation was these were original thoughts and statements from the authors who were submitting the paper. So we wrote an email to the senior author, and the senior author says, well, how would I recognize that? Okay, and it's a valid point. If the paper was written by the fellow, how will the senior author recognize that? Well, if it's in an area that you or the senior author is an expert in, you should have a sense for what the literature looks like. But it's quite difficult to know if the exact phraseology that was used in the paper is the same phraseology that came from another manuscript. So we appreciate that. But as for those of you who are on here who are mentors and not fellows, please pay particular attention. And I always say, Jose is on the line, my fellow. I always say to Jose, this is our wording, right? This has not come from anywhere else. And that's very, very important to consider. We use screening software. It's called Authenticate. This is academic fraud. All JSM submissions undergo plagiarism screen. Greater than 25% similarity on the papers triggers a formal review of overlap. So the Authenticate will give us an overlap number, 31%. We've had papers of 80%. Anything that's really over 50%, there's clearly something remiss going on. So we do review it and look at it in greater detail. Significant overlap, we simply ask the authors to rewrite it. We don't presume that it's malfeasance. We just ask you to rewrite it, especially if it's your own phrase. And it'll tell us, by the way, like 2 lines have come out of this paper, and on the side it tells us which paper it came from. If it's your paper, I'll know who wrote the paper. If it's your paper, then we just say, hey, listen, can you just rewrite this so it doesn't look as if it's plagiarized? If you've done this and we've written to you and you do it a second time, you'll actually get a warning letter. And this has happened several times in the last few years now. And on the 3rd offense, this is when we ban people. We had a very famous case a few years ago for international authors who, over the course of a year, persistently, heavily plagiarized. And plagiarism of the overlap of 80%, 75%. And it's hard to believe that they were all just innocent mistakes. So they got banned. And you don't want that on your CV. I'm going to finish up by talking very briefly about predatory journals. This is very important as neophytes in the field that you're aware of this. Predatory journals are journals. We have one in the field, and it has a very similar name to JSM. And you have to be very careful. If Alan's name is not on the invitation letter or a decision, or if my name's not on it, or Erwin Goldstein's name is on it, it's not from our journals. Just be very, very careful. We've had several very famous people who submitted papers to these other journals. And when you submit it and it gets accepted, which it nearly always does, you can't get it back. You can't get it back and publish it elsewhere. They typically offer an incredibly rapid review. Often there's no peer review whatsoever. It just gets accepted the next day. Cheap open access publication, but there is a fee for open access, but the open access publication fee for Alan's journal, if you're an ISSM member, is $500, but they'll have $200. But you know, there are thousands of papers going into these journals and $200 a pop. So it's a money-making scam. There's immediate online publication, often without any editing of the actual manuscript for linguistic issues, etc. There's no filing of metadata with various databases. So if you do a search for your paper and it's published in one of these open access journals that are predatory, and by the way, not all open access journals are predatory, but if it is a predatory journal, you won't find it. You won't be able, it won't get cited. It won't contribute to your H-index or anything like that. There's no effort to preserve the manuscript for the future. So the metadata is not saved. So it's just sitting out there in space, and somebody's just made money off you, and you'll end up putting on your CV. But if somebody goes and reviews the literature, they won't find it. Okay. It's an unusable citation, and many journals will not accept citations from these particular journals. If you're interested in looking at the list of these fake journals, Beals, the Beals database, B-E-A-L-L, Dr. Beal, I can't remember his first name, a few years ago, got very interested in this, and you'll see a list of predatory journals on his website. The article technically is not officially published. It pollutes the literature with unverified data, kind of fake news kind of thing. They often have names similar to established titles, aggressive article recruitment emails. They promise editorial positions. EIC is often never identified. By the way, as you progress through your career, those of you who go into academics, you want to make sure that your name doesn't end up on the editorial board of one of these journals without you knowing. We've had several cases in the last year where people didn't know that they were on the editorial board of a, let's say, fake predatory journal. They were never invited, but they have their photograph on there, and it's just fake, and it's not good for your reputation. The editorial board often contains a mixture of names, and in our field, if they're there, often names that you've never heard of. Sexual medicine is a fairly small space, so you should know pretty much all the big names in the field, and if there's somebody's name on there you don't recognize, it might be a kind of a cause for concern. This is the URL for the Beals list, looking at a list of predatory journals. And I think that's the last question that our last slide that I have. So, so let's go through the questions here. There was a question for Alan about references. I think, Alan, your comment is perfectly good. That the reference list number is guidance, 20 references, but if you've got 25, 26, and we believe that those references are important, then we're not going to make a big deal about that. Alan sent, just on chat, he sent a link to discuss type 1 versus type 2 errors in papers. Jason Levy, much of what was discussed on reviewing seems to be contrary to papers on original research. Do you have a different mindset or thought process when reviewing meta-analysis, systematic reviews, or surgical techniques papers, such as something going into the surgeon's corner? Alan, do you have comments on that? Is Alan still here? Maybe he's not. Landon?
And I went into some detail in the answer a little bit below that, but so for systematic reviews, and many journals like JSM, for example, won't really take a review article anymore, but it needs to be like a true meta-analysis or systematic review. And the key thing on that is just making sure that there's something novel to it. If there's 7 other meta-analyses and there's only 3 papers included in each of the meta-analyses, it's not going to get accepted, at least not at JSM for it. But if you are doing a meta-analysis and it's twice as big as the last one that's been published, or you have a different way that you're looking at, or a different answer, something novel, then you're going to be a little bit more likely to get picked up. And that same comment or question about Surgeon's Corner and how do you go about doing that? If it's just something that this is how I do it, so this is my surgical series, how I do it, there's not a lot of value in that, because for Peyronie's, for example, there's 60 plication series which have been published out there, or whatever the case. And so you have to have something novel, something that's going to advance the field or advance the area in some way.
And I guess I'm sorry I missed it, John. I was having connection issues. But again, in light of what Landon said, and my take is that always with literature, you're trying to expand knowledge or resolve a question or address an issue that's controversial or poorly understood. And I think meta-analyses and systematic reviews are still efforts to do the same thing. I mean, you're doing an experiment of sorts with the data that exists. So I think the mindset and the basic principles are similar, even if the methodology is somewhat different. Because again, scientists is distinguished not by their test tubes and beakers, but by their methods. And I think the methods are similar in that regard when doing a review or an authorship.
Yeah, this is a very point of active discussion within journals now. So you have systematic reviews with meta-analyses. You have systematic reviews without meta-analysis. And then you have scoping reviews. And so when these come into JSM now, we reach out to our statisticians, okay, and we have them look at it, and they're looking at the methodology and assessment of bias and heterogeneity, et cetera, et cetera. It will be very important for systematic reviews and really any original research that you adhere to JSM's request for checklist submission. So whether it be a Prisma checklist or whether it be a consort checklist, that you go down the checklist and make that clear. That is looked at by the editorial staff before it gets sent out to the editors for reviewer assignment. So pay particular attention to that. I think Landon and Alan's comments are well taken. I think the flurry of systematic reviews is dying down a little bit. It was identified as an area where journals were really interested in. We've had such a flood of them that we're being very selective now. And I think to Landon's point, if you're the 5th systematic review in shockwave, low intensity shockwave therapy in ED, it's probably not going to get accepted at this stage unless you're including many more papers in the data analysis. Okay, Jason, that's talked about Surgeon's Corner.
John, if I could jump in on that too, actually, aside from just the 5th review on shockwave for ED, we see a lot of papers of meta-analyses, systematic reviews for non-controversial topics, or the my dog spot kind of thing of like people who have lupus or, insert the chronic disease diagnosis here also have ED or female sexual dysfunction. Yeah. And I guess the feeling I have about that, and I think my wife, who's an associate editor as well, is cognizant of this, that it should be an interesting question and not just saying that, yes, people who have problems have problems. And I think that's something that I would tend to deprioritize in terms of areas for active research and publication.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that, Alan. I think that's a very fair point. Any other questions from any of the attendees? Thank you all for staying so late. It's gone a little bit longer than I thought it would, but if you don't have questions now, Landon, any final comments you'd like to make?
I noticed that Jose posted a question here about software for plagiarism, and the way I interpret it is you're saying, is there software that we can get ourselves to look and see who would be on there, if I'm interpreting the question correctly? So I'm not aware of anything like that. John, do you know of anything that's kind of a open source free software to do that?
I don't, but I know that Memorial Sloan Kettering are looking to invest their editorial groups. We've got an editorial group in urology, surgery, medicine. The editorial groups are discussing whether they're going to actually do that for us. And this goes back to the point where, how do I know, you know, if what Jose writes hasn't come out of another paper, right? I mean, I asked the question and it's not, but you know, how do you know unless you run the data? So I think the future will be that before you submit your paper, it'll undergo some kind of plagiarism check. I think it'll be incumbent upon all of us to do that. So I think that would be a big step forward for everybody. Alan, any final thoughts?
We all love publishing, and I think it's one of the more exciting things I do. So writing, reviewing, editing, it's not always the most glorious, but it certainly is a lot of fun, and you make good colleagues and friends and advance your career in ways that are very important, I think. So I'm glad you all attended. I hope you all get something out of it, being here for this talk by these experts, two experts and me.
I think I can speak for all of us when, you know, if you have questions, don't be afraid to ask us. Sexual medicine is a small area. If you go into sexual medicine, we will be at meetings together for the next, hopefully 20 years more. And, you know, we want to see people flourish and be successful. So use us as a resource. So with that, have a good night, everybody. It's getting late on the East Coast, and we look forward to seeing many of you at Sexual Medicine Society meeting in Arizona next week. So Bobby, we're going to sign off, okay?
Okay, everyone
All
have
right.
a great evening.
Good night, everyone.
And